I have notes.
Oh, you have notes?
I fucking have notes because I had to on this episode.
I got some notes right here.
Let's just go.
Oh my goodness. Hello, friends, Romans, country people. Welcome to Homicide, Life on Repeat, the show where we rewatch, we recap, and we relive arguably the greatest and most influential television show of all time, Homicide, Life on the Street. And I am joined, as always, by the delicious and highly nutritious Mr. Kyle Secor.
It just gets better every time you introduce me because now we're to delicious.
I mean, you are delicious, work
Thanks.
wife. You are.
Thank you, Reed.
Kyle played Detective Tim Bayliss on the show, and I am Reed Diamond, and I played Detective Michael Kellerman, a later arrival to the show.
Another iteration. Reed, you know what?
Tell me,
I'm thinking we need to add in our dancing that we do to the theme song.
would you like me to add the dancing?
I think we just have to add that in because I look over at you and you're doing some good stuff.
I've been saving the dancing from, I have everyone. I got Tom Fontana dancing in the background from last week. I'm going to do a special cut of just that. But Kyle, here we are. We are talking about Homicide, Life on the Street, episode 108, 108, and the Rocket's Dead Glare.
Oh, that's a good title.
I don't think so. As the title guy, I think it's the weakest title of the season because, as you know, I'm a nerd for the titles, and I always feel like the titles are sort of, they usually reveal the spine of the show, sort of an overall theme. And the Rocket's Dead Glare refers to And the Rocket's Red Glare from the Star Spangled Banner, which is a Baltimore reference because it was written by Francis Scott Key at Fort McHenry during some battle in the War of 1812. But the historical world that we dive into in this episode is actually the Lincoln assassination, and that takes place in Washington, D.C.
It's confusing. It's very confusing, Reed.
It's more punny than anything, isn't it?
It is. I think so. And And I mean, the whole episode initially pissed me off. So we can get into that.
Well, luckily we have a very, very special guest today who is going to help us through the miasma of 108 and the Rocket's Dead Glare. So do you mind if, without any further ado, I introduce our guest?
I think you should, Reed. Please do.
Let's do it.
What do we got?
Got a guest for you.
What's it for?
All for you.
That's right. What do we got?
Got a guest for you.
Who's it for?
All for you. All for you.
Today's guest is a TV writer and longtime Homicide fan who first became known on Twitter as the screenwriter blogger The Bitter Script Reader, which is where I first discovered this amazing, amazing human. Most recently, he was a writer on the CW's Superman and Lois, which just wrapped its 4th season. Now, you often hear me say that I have friends exclusively because of Homicide, the Homicide show that we're here talking about, Homicide, Life on the Street. The bust in the center of that pantheon of my friends from this show is this man. And also, you oftentimes hear me say on this show that there are people out there who know infinitely more about Homicide, Life on the Street than either Kyle or I do.
The brain trust.
The brain trust. And every time I say that, I'm thinking of our very special guest, the great and powerful Adam Mallinger.
Thank you, guys. Did I just get a longer introduction than Tom Fontana and David Simon put together?
Yes, you did. I should just state right out of the gate, when Kyle proposed doing a rewatch podcast to me, I was a little dubious.
What?
Not because of you. I didn't have doubts about you, but I wasn't sure if I was interested in the rewatch podcast genre or oeuvre. When I acquiesced and I said, yes, I would love to do this rewatch podcast with you, the first person I reached out to was Adam, to ask him, what do you want in a Homicide rewatch podcast? Because I knew that he had the taste and the cultivation and the discernment in true Adam style, as the great writer he is. Within moments, he wrote me back the most detailed and voluminous email about what he was looking for in a rewatch podcast. And I have to say, without question, I have used your words of wisdom as my guiding mantra for this show.
I thought you were going to say that we went against every single thing he wrote.
I was going to say that in true writer to actor form, I did write an email because I've watched and listened to a lot of these podcasts. I'm like, oh, here's what I've seen, and here's what I've seen get a reaction. And I got a great response from Reed, which was essentially, oh, I was thinking exactly along these lines already. Thanks.
Yes.
It's true, because I was like, I don't want to go through the granular details of every single episode and talk about beat to beat. And when I'd sort of done my own research, and this is not throwing shade, as the youngsters say, upon any other rewatch podcast, I was like, I kind of want to just know the stories. And what makes Homicide so interesting is that it was a crazy time, as we've established. It was the Wild West out there. There's some very, very bad behavior and hilarious behavior. Now enough time has passed that we can actually talk about it. And I go, that's what I want. I want the behind the scenes stories. And you said that right away, like, don't spend the beginning of the show talking about your day or your week. And we want to hear the stories that only you guys could tell, the behind the scenes stories. And that's what we've aspired, and I think you succeeded in doing.
And do you remember what I said when you then said, oh, we would love to have you on the podcast? I'm like, I'll do any episode. Pick me for one of the duds. It'll be fun.
Well, that's what we did, Adam.
You're here. No, it's not a full-on dud. I do want to state it's a relative. If you were to rank the 9 episodes of season 1, this would be number 9, at least in my personal estimation. And I had not watched this episode in 25 years. Like, I have all the DVDs, as I showed you guys. I watched it again and again when it was on Lifetime and later Court TV. So I'm familiar with it, but this is not one I have bothered watching. And so it was kind of cool that I was like, oh, I'll get to watch one I haven't seen in ages. It'll be like watching it with fresh eyes.
This was a skip for you whenever you rewatched.
It was. And no disrespect to the writers, because this sounds a million times worse now that I am a TV writer. I didn't sound quite as much of a dick when I was just some guy on alt TV Homicide saying this, and now I'm like picturing like, oh no, I have writing credits. It sounds a million times worse coming out of that mouth. You know, you're coming right off of the heels, not right off the heels, there's an episode in between, but you have 3 Men and Adina. You know, it feels like, okay, well, Frank and Tim got their big thing, you know, there, so we've got to kind of, you know, balance it out and give other people some stories. And there's some stuff in here I like, but it is, you know, I'm watching this and I'm remembering, oh right, like the next one has the fun thing with the copier. And
you're not really saying anything against the writers, because for a show to come together, so much has to go right. And it's still always a miracle when a series or an episode comes together, because everything kind of has to go right, and one thing can throw it off. And in this one, it has an almost un-Homicide feel to it, in that as the season goes from the first episode up to 3 Men and Adina, you can see them finding their way. But at this point, it seemed like it was a bit of anarchy, and which I hope Kyle can speak to it. I know that you didn't have much to do in this episode.
I'm not bitter about that, Reed. I had my moment.
But I have a question for you, because you didn't have much to do in this episode. But was that a piece of Lotsie you did bumping into the chair, or did that actually happen?
Well, I was trying to think back. That's my favorite moment for my stuff in that. I think that I hit it not on purpose.
So you think you didn't do it on purpose?
No, I can't do things like that.
Because it's one of my most favorite moments in the entire episode.
It's a good moment.
It's important to point out at this point that the director is Peter Markle, who directed Hot Dog the movie. Okay, so Peter Markle directed Hot Dog the movie, which is amongst the pantheon of the great ski movies of the 80s. Right. Now, my favorite one is Ski School with Dean Cameron. I think that is the superior.
I love Dean. Do you know Dean?
I love Dean. Dean's one of my favorite people in the entire world. Summer School is as an 80s go-to backwards and forwards, because in the 80s, before Adam was born,
Nope, I'm afraid not.
Well, and I was in high school, and you might have been a little out of high school at the point. I don't know, Kyle. I don't want to.
I was already in rehab by that time, Reed.
Rehab by the 80s. There was this great sort of early mid-80s genre of frat party. Because what was the one you must know, Adam?
A bachelor party. You're thinking of Bachelor Party.
Bachelor Party. There's Bachelor Party, and then there was all these things where we're either in college, we're going off on spring break, and then there was a whole subgenre of the ski movies. So Peter Markle, his first major movie was Hot Dog, the movie with David Naughton, American Werewolf in London, and the Dr. Pepper fellow. And then after that, he did Young Blood, a ice hockey movie with Rob Lowe, Patrick Swayze, and an unknown Keanu Reeves, who was actually quite a talented hockey player. Patrick Swayze had been a figure skater, so the only one who had to learn how to skate properly and hit a puck was Mr. Lowe. But apparently Peter Markle played on the U.S. national team. Did you, as a sports person, Kyle, I guess you didn't talk to Peter about
I don't remember Peter. I don't remember. Right. I just don't remember him. I don't remember much of the character about this entire thing. Maybe that's because I wasn't in it a lot, but I don't remember. But I also read his credits and I thought, wow, he's had a terrific career. And anyway, look,
because that's what it feels like from the outside, from watching it.
That he's directing Hot Dogs?
Well, not that he's directing Hot Dogs. That I think he had a very generous or laissez-faire attitude with the actors, because the acting is all over the place in this one.
And you called it generous,
right? Okay.
So, which we like. I mean, we like generosity in directors with actors. We also like directors that'll come in and will say, "Hey, let's tone that down a bit. Let's take that back a little bit. Let's do," and you kind of have to have balls to do that as a guest director coming in on, to kind of deal with these actors. And to me, for whatever reason, that just wasn't happening in so many different places, because our actors, we could be very theatrical and we could really put it out there, and we really wanted to kind of push the envelope. We needed people to come in and say, hey, tonally, let's just, let's fold that in to what's going on writing wise and stuff like that. And this time, for whatever reason, there were a number of scenes where that didn't happen in. And so that, for me, what was just kind of for this episode. But there's so many delights in it as well. So I think he got some stuff right and some stuff he kind of let go.
Yeah, can I point out, I think Belzer, this is maybe the one of the first times we see Munch emerge in the way that he eventually becomes. And, it was the first time in watching this one that I realized, once they got rid of Crissetti's conspiracy theory tendencies all got absorbed into Munch, and that is missing from Munch in these proto episodes, is that he's not the guy who jumps off with the conspiracies, because that's Crissetti's role, is to go, Edwin Stanton and John Wilkes Booth and all of these conspiracy things. But we see Munch is finally given a chance to go on about hemp and all about his crazy conspiracies. The one thing he says wrong in that is the Declaration of Independence is printed on hemp, which is completely incorrect. I understand.
Awesome.
But everything else in there...
Is that incorrect?
Yeah, apparently that's incorrect, because I was looking and trying to verify that. But everything else there, I'm like, this, and then in the next episode this continues, because I remember that guest actor returns in the next episode when they have a bus. That is the first time where we got to see that side of Munch, where he's not just kind of being taken down a peg by Bolander. This is he's in his element. There's a little bit here that I feel like is kind of important later on, and then we kind of get to see, I think the courtroom stuff with Kay was also interesting, and all of that is taken straight from the book. So much of that dialogue is taken straight from David Simon's book.
Of course. You bring up two very important parts of this episode. One of the things I really enjoyed about this episode was the Munch stuff. It's also that great Jorge Zamacona arcana that he always puts into an episode, because this didn't have as much as his last one, but having all of the hemp conversation, and I think also having the drug conversation, the way that they're having it on television, as we stress each week, the things that now are ubiquitous and you see on shows all the time. I guarantee you this conversation had not happened on network television before, where you question the war on drugs. Now it's ubiquitous. You'll be like, well, you can go get drunk, but you can't use drugs. Just even the idea that maybe one of these detectives smokes weed is really interesting. And it fits him, because I love the Lincoln stuff, and that's a fun Crissetti thing, but Munch being the conspiracy theorist is a much more natural fit, because that's really who Belzer was, as is the weed conversation.
Yeah. He wrote a couple of books or at least one book that was mostly about conspiracy stuff.
I remember reading that one,
Another thing that really intrigued me about this was the assassination storyline. Not so much what was going on in there, but, they brought in at the top of this show an actress named Bai Ling. She has such a history. That scene with her and saying what they do, the ones that call at night and all of that stuff, seemed like such a pure indictment of the leadership over there and what they were doing. But Bai Ling was, she grew up during the Chinese, what was 66 to 67? With
Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, the Cultural Revolution. There she was for the first 10 years of her life. She was in the Cultural Revolution. Then she went off to Tibet to be an actress soldier doing musicals in Tibet.
In Tibet?
In Tibet, because that's where they sent her. She was sent off to work camp, to labor camp. She was sent off to Tibet. She was then in Tibet. And then she came back and she started acting and she wanted to get out of China and she went to NYU.
Hey, Kyle.
Yes,
when she went
what
to
is
Tibet,
it?
was she in Hello, Dalai Lama?
Yeah, she was, Reed.
Sorry.
And she had a really good role in that, too, as the 16th reincarnation of awful.
Sorry, we're on our 11th episode of the season at this point.
Really, that was her first role that she had done on TV other than a soap opera. That whole thing was kind of tough to watch because of the casual racism that, the Crosetti and all that stuff. But then I realized in Homicide, we've done that throughout the series. There was something really kind of clunky about it all. That whole storyline was very, very odd to me. It was just very odd tonally, and what happened with the Secret Service agents and with Ed Lauder and all of that. We could go
The weird thing about that is that it's one of those things that I know frustrates a network, and certainly a network in 1993, because there's no real resolution to it. It starts with the murder. The second or third scene of that plot is, oh, well, your prime suspect has absconded the country. I can't help you at all. Hey, let's go see some sights. Let's
go sightseeing.
And so, it's not even like they're spending that time trying to put together. It's like they're told in the second one, there's no resolution to this case, but hey, let me help you out. It's a very Homicide plot in some ways, but I feel like in later seasons this would have been done differently. But it's absolutely the kind of thing that I imagine a network executive who had not been trained what a Homicide episode was yet got the script and was like, wait, I'm very confused by what you guys are trying to do in this episode.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they hated it. I mean, Tom said, ad nauseum, ad infinitum, how much they hated the lack of resolution and the lack of clarity about who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And you're absolutely right, because I thought later on, if they'd done this, if the whole episode was about, you've got this murder and you know who it is, but you're getting resistance from the government and you're not going to be able to solve it because you're going to step on too many international or bigwig toes, that's a very intriguing and very Homicide episode where you're going to be frustrated by the guys upstairs or the guys in DC. It also felt like in that Homicide way, knowing how tight the budgets are, they're like, we've got 12 hours in DC.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can't turn off your production brain on this show. And we're going to make it count. We're going to make sure that there are landmarks here so that people know we spent the time. But the thing I thought of is in later seasons, there would have been someone emotionally involved with the victim. So you would have gotten a non-resolution of someone would have gone to, the autopsy, or there would have been a scene of calling home or somebody lamenting, oh, look, he's over here and there's no one. That would have been played more. But the victim is just used to kind of launch Crocetti's tourism of Washington, D.C.
You mentioned earlier the court stuff. What was so cool about that and so Homicide, I wish they'd actually never gone into the courtroom, because what was so exciting was them being in that anteroom waiting to go in and not being allowed to watch the proceedings. And that's an aspect of going to court that you never see, because on Law and Order, everyone always is in the gallery, right? But to know that that's what the cops' experience really of a trial is, and the tension of you're not going to get to see what's happening until you're called in, and then the pressure of, and obviously in the book, and because I'd love to hear what you pulled from the book.
But if anybody listening wants to find exactly where it is in the book, because the book is very long and there's no index, in my paperback copy right here, the segment starts on page 489, and that's the whole discussion of the trial and all of that. And it's part of a larger chapter about Baltimore prosecutors and detectives in general, which that part starts on page 474. On Kindle, the trial part starts on page 483, and the general court thing starts on page 467. I did my homework on this one.
Adam, this is great. How many pages does that book go up to? I'm done at 250 usually.
It's 631 in paperback.
What? God.
Well, this is why Kyle never read the book.
I remember I was listening to an earlier one, and Kyle, I think it was with David Simon, and you're like, oh, I'm getting into it. It's great.
I'm catching up now.
David's like, well, it's been 30 years. I'm very glad for you.
Adam, this is why we have you here.
It is a long book, but it's a very engrossing book, and especially, certainly, Kyle, you're going to be reading it, and you're going to recognize, oh, hey, that was, beyond, the LaTanya Wallace, Adina Watson stuff. The first scene with Danvers has scenes pulled right from there. It says, oh, don't screw this up. Well, it came to be pre-screwed. That's phrased the way you would expect it to be phrased, in Baltimore in real life, but it's the same dynamic. It's interesting because that whole bit on the stand where Kay has been told, don't mention this case, you're not allowed to mention mention this case. And then the defense attorney blunders into, come on, have you ever seen a case where someone was killed by 2 different methods? And she's like, yeah. And he says, come on, name it. Like, that played out exactly like that in real life.
Adam, this is why we have you here today, because you know what time it is. I'm not going to get any of those angry comments in the YouTube section about that we didn't do enough detail.
The other thing in that chapter I'll point out, because it was kind of related to what you're saying, is Simon, he goes into more detail here. I'm not going to read the whole thing because that would be the whole podcast. But he says that in that year, there were 200 perpetrators brought Baltimore prosecutors. 64 of those 200 ended up with cases dismissed or not going to trial for one reason or another. And he breaks that down. And of the 136 left, 81 will plea before trial. That's 41% of the people plea out before they get near a courtroom. And it leaves only 55 or 28% going to trial. And so those are the stats that you're up against in the Baltimore legal system. If this is too much of a digression, we can cut it off here. But there was something, Kyle, that I got from your blog a couple months ago, so I'll give a plug to that, where you had brought up this article in New York Magazine looking back at the legacy of the David Simon TV shows, and it brought up the fact that several of the detectives in the book have later been accused of misconduct or have been putting away people who were not guilty or have been exonerated 30 years after the fact. And so it's interesting because in the book, the slant is, with all of this against these hard-working prosecutors and detectives, the odds that a guilty man gets convicted is so long. So certainly the odds that an innocent man could slip through, it's astronomical. It doesn't happen. And so to read those two articles alongside each other, and I wrote down the title in case anyone wants to Google it. It's called David Simon Made Baltimore Detectives Famous. Now Their Cases Are Falling Apart. And it's just an interesting contrast to what the book says, which makes you realize, oh my gosh, there's so many more guilty people who go free. But the key is in that plead thing. These guilty people who went away more often than not pled guilty because they were convinced the case against them was so strong. But I did want to bring that up because it's part of the same chapter in the book as this episode's storyline.
You know, and also I know David kind of talked about that not too long ago about what had happened and how, you know, being embedded with them, that he was in that world. And so he was writing from that world and he wasn't like stepping out to look at some of the, you know, the shenanigans that were, he wrote towards that. I mean, we weren't saints. And he also, he talked about that they weren't saints as well. Then you see the real world implications of that later on with these same detectives.
But I think it's interesting because there's a lot of talk now about like propaganda shows that are making cops look like heroes for breaking the rules. And I'm wondering, like, as you point out, like David wrote it honestly and you portray it honestly. Now, granted, the slant and the takeaway in the book is different. Do you feel like it was honest to the cops' experience? Like, I don't think these guys, if you dig into their stories, they don't think they're committing misconduct. They think this guy is guilty and I'm just going the extra mile to get a guy who's guilty. That feels like kind of the process you guys would have gone through as TV cops of like, I know this son of a bitch did it. You know, what am I going to do about it? How do I get him? How do I trip him up in the box? How do I convince him I've got a case?
Definitely. We were all just trying to do the right thing. Watching it now, I can now see the brilliance of the writing of this. And especially, I think, with Andre's character and the coercion that he goes through. So it's all in there. But he's also doing what he thinks is the right thing. So just to get
which I think is maybe why the show feels like still of the moment today, because all of that stuff is relevant and you can still believe that. There are times in the second season where Pembleton goes hard to make a point that he could do it. And in a way that's chilling because you have your hero doing something that the hero shouldn't do, but also disowning it, but you still know he could do it. I had an interesting reaction one time when I was rewatching the pilot, one of the many times that I have, and my wife was sitting next to me, and in that brilliant interrogation scene that you and Andre have at the end of the episode, I'm going, oh my gosh, isn't it great? This is great writing. This is masterful. And she is like, holy this is what everything that is wrong with, like, she had the reaction you would expect someone would have today.
Right.
She was Bayless, essentially, you know, like she's going in and she's starting to actually almost basically say your lines, Kyle. And I'm like, wait, hold up, hang on. They're going to step outside and then Tim is going to say everything you were saying right now. And I think the show holds up in some ways because it isn't just doing that and then everybody patting each other on the back. In researching this episode specifically, it is kind of funny that you run across this 30-year legacy of like, oh, okay, these guys who we have become sympathetic to both through the book and the series, there's a completely other side to this story that is very tragic and ruined lives. But on the show, when you guys do it, it is always justified. So it's not like 30 years later, with one or two exceptions, we're going to revisit Kellerman and Bayless and go, oh my God, these guys are bad guys. But I'm getting ahead of the arc of the series there.
We had a lot of morally ambiguous, ambivalent characters. They had all of the failings and all of the blind spots.
They were usually oftentimes pointed out to by their partner. If there were no cameras on the room, like in an interrogation, there would just be two guys there interrogating someone. We're never going to see the guy looking over going, man, that's a fucked up way to ask that question, because the Homicide writers were so brilliant and the way it was shot was so brilliant. We get to see the questioning going on. So we as the audience get to go, yeah, I'm with that guy who's questioning it. Or you can say, I'm with that guy who's going to take this guy down no matter what.
And that's a great thing in when you're arguing among a bunch of writers and people are arguing the merits of it. Someone always says, let's put it on screen. That's the thing. If we're having this argument, our guys should be having this argument. That scene there, there's a version where like Frank interrogating someone is some writer's idea. That's a fantastic, brilliant interrogation. And someone goes, wait, this is bullshit. And then eventually someone says, oh, we should put that in the scene. We should put him in the room with somebody who absolutely is diametrically opposed to him. And then afterwards he can say, what the hell was that? But my question to you guys, because we now know a different side to these people who inspired some of your characters, if you were playing that role today and you knew the outcome of the real life arc, is there a part of you that wonders if it would color how you created that character? Like, you played it the right way for the script at the time because you don't know the outcome and your character doesn't know the outcome. If you, Kyle Secor, knew what Tom Pellegrini was doing, would be found out, or accused of later in life, do you think that would shade how you portrayed some of his stuff at the time?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know, because meeting him and being around him, I didn't get the sense of any of that. And maybe if I would have known that and met him, like in some sort of alternate universe, known him and met him, knowing what he had his arc was after that, I would have had different questions. But, unless the writers know about that shit and it's not in the scene, I'm not necessarily acting any of that. But I would probably have a different kind of take on it. I'm just not sure.
Well, you both have played villains before. I mean, actually, we have two superhero universes represented here. You were in the Arrowverse, Kyle, and Reed was in the MCU, and you were both villains there. There, obviously, you're the antagonist, and so there's a function you're fulfilling and all of that. But when you were creating those parts, was there also a part of you that was trying very hard to, like, okay, if this guy was the star of the show, this is what I am bringing to it?
It's only in just the last 2 years that I've started creating villains who are actually evil sociopaths, because I always build my villains the way I build my other characters, that it always comes from a place of love. There's something they love and they're trying to protect it. They're trying to make the world better for their children or give their children a better outcome. The more I've read, I realize it's just evil motherfuckers out there who are just power hungry and sociopaths. But with this show, I think we layered it in. I know I certainly did. Building Kellerman, my mantra for him, my sort of spine for him, is he got onto the job to make the world safer for old ladies and kids. So whatever it took to make the world safer for old ladies and kids, he was probably down with. His sort of demise was inevitable because he's too emotional and he's going to take the law into his own hands to do the right thing. But that's not something that we saw. Or as you say, in the, what did you call it?
Propaganda.
In the propaganda of it, yes. And he got his comeuppance and his partner turned on him and that was it. I think it's very common, especially and I think we talked about the closed world and we showed it on Homicide. I mean, obviously they did it brilliantly on The Wire and then The Shield takes it to a whole nother level. I think it's important to, put all those colors in there. What do you think, Kyle?
Well, since I didn't read David Simon's book until now, enough came out of it that I did read at the very beginning where I just latched onto it. And like you said, Reed, protecting your kids, whatever it is, mine was, we're doing God's work. And whatever it took to do God's work, that's what I was going to do. And that continued through to the end of even, taking down Luke, whatever.
Luke Ryland.
What was his name? Come on.
Yep.
Thank you. I don't remember the people that I kill.
I told you, ladies and gentlemen, friends, Romans, Adam knows more about this show than we ever will.
The thing is, there are bigger super fans than me. I will cede that title to anybody who was on alt TV Homicide in the 90s. Yeah.
Right?
I lurked there. I'm sure you could probably dig up old posts of mine from like season 7 when I was off in college and I could finally, get on Usenet and all of that. And there are young people listening to this who's have no idea of any of what I'm talking about, I'm sure.
Can we talk about it? Because
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting. So, like, you started watching the show. Were you 13? Did you say? when you started watching the
I
show?
came
How-
in at the Law and Order Homicide crossover because it was just such a neat idea that you would have two dramatic shows cross over like that. I had never seen anything like that.
Right.
Two shows that weren't, related in any way.
Where did you
I
first
watched it
watch
on
it?
NBC, so I saw it.
With your with
Yeah,
anyone,
my mom.
with your parents? Or?
I think my mom had watched Homicide. That crossover is in season 4. I know there are a couple of season 3 episodes I saw snippets of while my mom was watching. My mom introduced me to that, to Buffy, to Dawson's Creek. 3 shows that are kind of like seminal shows she was watching well before I was. And I think X-Files. So four big shows in the 90s she was ahead of the curve on. But I came in. I started watching regularly with that crossover, which is that's 96. So I was 16. I was a sophomore in high school, and I just stuck around after the crossover because it was so interesting. I had kind of casually watched Law and Order before that, and that episode made me a regular viewer of Law and Order and a regular viewer of Homicide. I went through high school watching it, and possibly being the only person in my class watching it. I remember a couple of teachers watched it, so I would come in on Monday and I'd be like, "Oh my God, did you see that? Did you see the promo for next week? They're all getting shot in the station, blah blah blah." But when I went off to college, it was right when schools were being fitted with T1 lines, high-speed internet, and I discovered Usenet, which was the way you would talk about TV or anything. It was online discussion boards, bulletin boards, and there was Alt TV Homicide, and there were these people who were just as obsessed with the show as I was, and so it was a great place to go and get reactions. And this is during season 7 by that point, so the reactions were, I'll say, mixed.
Thank you.
Arguably, our best season was 7. Come on, Adam.
Oh, also somewhere in there, like season 4, I should say, that was also when NBC was really seemingly putting a lot of promo muscle behind it. It was when I remember seeing ads that were like, Andre Braugher, the greatest actor on television ever. And I kind of always wondered, Kyle, how the rest of you on set felt about that. Yeah,
What?
exactly.
Huh?
Can you say? I'll tell my favorite Andre story about that.
Go ahead. You go, Reed.
The first 2 years I'm on the show, I would be at the mall in Towson or whatever, and they're like, "What do you do?" And I'm like, "I'm on Homicide." It's like, "Oh, I love that show. That Andre Braugher, he's amazing." And then I'm like, "And?"
No, that happened all the time. But truly, on the set or anything like that, there was never anything.
No.
We're just there doing our work, and everyone was doing the best they could do. And Andre happened to pop out, and that was the person you heard about every time someone said, "We watch Homicide."
In season 4 especially, he was getting TV Guide covers or whatever, and I think NBC realized it because after season 4, that summer in between 4 and 5, they were rerunning season 1 episodes, because I remember that was how I first saw 3 Men and Adina, some of the other season 1. So it was kind of like just when I fell into the show, watching the new episodes, they said, "Oh, here's a mini binge to catch up." And then the following year was when Lifetime started running the series from the beginning. And so I jumped right on that. It was this whole weird out-of-body experience catching up to where I had been. They were still running those episodes the way they had been run before. So, like, I knew Crissetti had disappeared, but I didn't know how. And then, as happens, we get the episode that tells his fate before we've seen his fate. And when they got to it, I assumed it had been done on purpose by, the show. My brain is, I'm watching the show and I'm like, oh, this is like Pulp Fiction because it's all out of order and it's all jumbled and they're like trusting the audience to catch up. It's like, it's deliberately like this. This is so smart. And, to a teenager, that's what made sense, is that of course they did this on purpose. They did it so we had 2 weeks of like, what the fuck just happened here? Why are they telling the story this way? And you get there and like, oh my God, that's so smart. These guys are geniuses. So I gave the show even more credit than it deserved at the time.
That's a brilliant way
Turning all your friends
I was probably insufferable because I would be like, oh, you've got to watch this show. Oh, it's on. You should see it. Oh, this episode. It's an entire one. It's an interrogation. It's 3 guys in one room. And you get these reactions like, oh, that sounds great. Yes. So of course I had to find the internet. I had to find other weirdos who were into this and as excited about it. And when you love this stuff on the internet, you also have to hate it. So you find the people who are nitpicking, like, oh, they're not doing enough of this. Why are Pembleton and Bayless not doing anything this season?
Oh, dude, I used to go in there. My recollection of that period in the late 90s was there was like the X-Files group and there was the Homicide group. We'd go in after every episode. Like,
what was it? The thing I found out, because I had not rewatched much of season 6 since it aired. There were a couple select episodes, but I hadn't done the whole thing. And so when Peacock put it up there, season 6 is not my favorite. It's not my least favorite. Let me go back and just rewatch it, try to be as objective as possible. There are some negative criticisms of that year that I think got carried away with themselves. Let's just try to be fair to season 6. I appreciated the picture of it more, like everyone else. I'm like Frank and Tim don't have enough to do this season. But once you kind of get over that hump, let's look at the choices they made with purpose and see how successful they were. Like, I did gain a new appreciation for season 6. I had forgotten how great, since I'll shine on both of you since I'm here, Shaggy Dog City Goat was a fun one right in the middle of the season. But I've forgotten just how clever that was and how much fun clearly all you guys were having, and Steve Allen and Jane Meadows. Like, that one actually really elevated for me when I did it on a recent rewatch.
Reed and Belzer.
Yeah, or was it murder?
That was really fun.
Yeah. That was. I do remember when I watched that live, thinking, "Gosh, why do they not do more of Belzer and Reed, or Munch and Kellerman together?" But
yeah, you guys were so well matched.
I wanted it so bad. I was partnerless for a while because they made that weird thing of me and Clark not being together. Like, Clark would have turned on me, or Meldrick would have turned on Kellerman. It's not taking it personally. But I loved those Munch team-ups, Kaddish, and when we go to the ballpark and all those different ones we had. That episode was so special. Kyle's directing, so you've got that level of freedom. Munch and I are together, Belzer and I are together. And then Steve and Jane.
Alan and Jane.
It was insane.
A quick story about that. I know it's not about this episode. When we went to scout the location for that apartment, they were hoarders. The people were hoarders, like really hoarders. And I went, don't change a thing. This is exactly how I want it. And I came back. The day we shot, they had cleaned everything up.
You mentioned Kaddish, Reed. I had a bunch of wave files from the show, and I had had them keyed when certain things, especially because this is the age of instant messenger. So all my friends had different alerts with it, it would play a different clip. And one of the clips I had was the exchange with you and Munch, where you say, "Oy vey mir, I'm so much sugar I could plots." I'll do it again. No. Which was one of my father's favorite exchanges from the show too. He got a kick out of that.
Because I was one of my favorite scenes to shoot ever. Just doing that bit. And Belzer was such a sweet, sweet guy. Talking about weed, though. Have I ever told you getting high at Belzer's house story?
Gosh, what would that be like? Go ahead, Reed.
It ties into Kaddish, and it ties into a bunch of things. So Harley and Richard invite me over for dinner because they took good care of me because I was on my own there in Baltimore. And so I went to their house for dinner. They had a very special guest, a friend from France. And so we sit down before dinner. The dinner table is literally only about 3 feet from where I'm sitting in the living room, and they break out a joint and pass it around. Now, I'm not a marijuana smoker. I drink beer, and that's about it. But I thought, well, these guys are all very sophisticated. Sure, I'll take a puff on this joint. 5 minutes later, 15 minutes later, who knows? Time has no meaning anymore. I am so unbelievably high. Now this French woman, starts telling a story about how the Nazis rounded up everyone in her village and took them to the camps. It's a very intense, dark story, and I am so high, and all I want to do is laugh. Not because of the story, but because I am baked. And I'm just like, you cannot laugh. This is not a funny story. Luckily, Belzer cracks a joke apropos of something else, and I just was like, I gotta get it all out now, and I get all of my laughter out. And then I spent the next half hour going, how am I gonna get from this chair to the dining room table 3 feet away, because I am so high. And that was the last time I smoked a joint at a fancy dinner party.
The French. We smoked joints before meals.
I'm a lightweight.
It's tough. At Belzer's, he had great pot.
He had great pot. And that's how we're coming full circle to the hemp story.
Okay, thoughts. Here's my thought. Was the no cops there to cops there cut to cover up something?
Oh, where they seem to basically, transport to the crime scene.
Yeah.
That struck me as, especially since it's one of the first shots of that act. I'm like, he thought he was doing something really cool there. It was really jarring.
Do you remember this, Reed, at the very beginning? So they come in, they're coming in on the van, and all of a sudden there's a jump cut to, there's no one there, and then all of a sudden they're there.
Right.
Is that
okay?
No, wait.
No controversy there.
You're too used to the homicide house style because you're like, oh yeah, we do.
Reed's going,
do that?
What's wrong? There's nothing. This happens all the time where I live in Maine.
Kyle, this brings up something I wanted to ask you about making the first season, because obviously you're making the show before you've seen what the show is going to be. And so was there ever a point when you were making the show where in your brain you go, I don't know what the fuck these guys are doing, or anything like that? Like when you finally saw a cut, did the show in any way resemble what you thought you guys were making, on set?
It must have been the first 1 or 2 episodes. They had us in a group talking, and then they said, everyone just move around and move to a different position. Now we're going to shoot it like that. And I went, oh, I see where we're at now. And we're breaking all the rules. Okay, got it. Great. And so from then on, it was never, what the fuck are these guys doing? It was like, we're breaking rules, which is what that was as well. To me, that was one of the most jarring Homicide cuts I had ever seen.
I must not be remembering it. It's Bolander and Munch.
Yeah, but there's no one there yet.
It's just the body and the dog comes up and the van is open. And then all of a sudden, like on a cut, boom, it's a crime scene. It's like a body and then it suddenly turns into a crime scene.
That sounds like a mistake.
It does sound like that something was covered up. They had to do something in order to jam that in there. Who knows? Could I bring up like just some fun little bits in this that I thought were great?
Kyle, you can do anything you want, buddy. No, yeah.
He's in Dickiesville talking to the Dickieyites. Do you remember this? That Bolander had gone to interview the woman in the sculpting studio. What the fuck was that? That was so amazing.
But that was like the most Law and Order moment that I've ever seen on Homicide, because she went back to sculpting. That's my beef with Law and Order. Is like a homicide detective is asking you questions, but you're going to carry on stacking the boxes. And she went back to sculpting. And I thought two problems with this. First of all, you've got a homicide detective asking you questions. But secondly, you're probably not going to be as focused on your sculpture as you should be. You should be focused on your art.
I did like there's a really small bit in that scene that I like that probably wouldn't be in the Law and Order version of the scene, is where he correctly spots, her race, whatever, and correctly deduces that she wouldn't be able to go up the stairs herself. And so he's like, oh, do they help you with the groceries? Like making a smart deduction like a detective would. And she's like, have you been watching me? I thought that was a neat little nuance that kind of kept it from just being like, okay, ma'am, did you see what color jacket was he wearing? Like,
I need you here every week.
But they do give it up. She does give it up quite quickly about the kid who she says, I love him very much. He's never done anything wrong to. He had a gun up to this guy's head. Yeah. Oh, okay. We'll go get him then. Andre, what a vulnerable thing. Him coming into the room with Barnfather and was it Gaffney?
No, that's Granger.
Granger, like a kid who's coming into the principal's office going, did I do something wrong? The stuff with he and G.
That was the Homicide storyline in this episode. That was my favorite line. The only one I wrote down. He says to G, I'm sorry I lied to you. And he said, yeah, me too. I'm sorry you lied to me, because it's changed our relationship on some level,
completely.
Right? And in an episode where occasionally actors were a little theatrical, the greatest theater actor in the show holds it in. That whole scene, and the beautiful scene with his wife, with Amy in the restaurant.
Amy.
Her first appearance on the show.
She's amazing.
My favorite part, too, is there's Andre smoking in a restaurant. Oh my gosh. The 90s. Remember that?
What he said to G about that you have this crappy job, it tells you where they're both at. That whole scene is amazing.
That had all of those layers that you expect from a Homicide episode. This tension between the two of them, plus interesting information and recollections, feels incredibly real. That relationship, the earlier one, where it was like, you want to get me in the box? He's like, no, not till I know why you're lying to me. That all has that reality to it that we crave from the show and that you aren't going to find at the time anywhere else.
I love how smoothly Frank lies when he comes in. What were you up there for? And he had locked and loaded. He plays it off like a joke. He kind of takes a shot at the bosses. G is lying just as much in that scene. He knows the truth, and he is being just as manipulative to Pembleton as he later accuses Pembleton of. So there was a little part of me, because I'm imagining myself in Pembleton's shoes there, where the boss is saying this, and where like he's then guilting him later about, I knew all along. That's where I'm like, well, screw you. You accused me of lying to you. You were playing me just as much as I was playing you. It was an interesting shade of Frank. If you gave me this scene as an assignment and said, how is Frank going to react to this? I would not have written Frank doing that, because my impulse would have been Frank calling out G on that. And it's interesting that it wasn't the impulse, and it doesn't feel false calling from Andre. I'm not calling it bad writing. I'm just saying it's going against exactly what you would expect of Frank's reaction when he has the whole scope of things. He's like, oh, we're puppets on a string, and yeah, you're making a point to me, but you coming here and getting in my face about your lying, you're dancing for them on a string just as much as I am. Like, you're acting like you're not a part of this, but you're playing into this little drama they've created.
I think another thing that it is that we see that Frank can be flattered.
Yes.
And it took him a bit of time to figure out where he stood. He did that through lying. He did that through having his dinner with his wife, who said, hey, don't do this for the money. But we could afford to go out for a few more dinners like this, but don't do it for the money. And Frank's taking it all in and then comes out with, I can't do it. And you have a crappy job, and I like doing what I do. That's pretty powerful.
And I think there's a later episode where he and G, unless I'm misremembering because I've watched a bunch of these, but there's one, I think it's in season 2, where Frank and G have a fight, and G says something like, you show me the same respect you show the white boys up there. And that really gets under Frank's skin. Maybe that was also intended as part of the subtext there, because it does come back, I think it's black and blue. Not 100% sure. Someone is screaming at me now that I'm being a bad fan. It's in the comments.
No, we'll cut it out. We'll make you look brilliant.
It's very layered. I thought they were both brilliant in those scenes. And another great, like Reed, you had said, another great homicide scene I thought was so much that happened out in the waiting room with Melissa and Danny, who's brilliant in this episode.
Danny's so good.
He's so good in this. Tying the tie at the beginning and then bringing out the little VCR thing and all of his food and just waiting. And Melissa's just like a wreck. But at the very end of that, when they win and they're standing out there and she's realized that whole stuff where she realizes that she likes Danvers.
Great
Excellent.
Shiner moment,
Yes.
by the way, too,
Oh,
when
God,
Shiner
yes,
comes out.
yes, yeah.
Classic
He
Shiner.
grabbed his crotch and by the way, a Shiner moment without a clipboard, so he had to have those lines solid.
It's early Shiner.
Yeah, it's
Early Shiner.
Yeah.
That whole thing where Danvers comes out to ask her out and then Pony Johnson comes down. They think they're going to have an eye fuck moment. They don't, and then go down the stairs and her belt gets caught and Danny improvise. That to me, that whole segment is pure homicide.
I love he's going to eye fuck us, and they were excited about it.
That's straight from the book too.
Oh, is it?
The ceremonial eye screw. Oh, and as in the show, they don't get any reaction.
And his defense attorney, Michael Willis.
God, I love him.
Awesome, because he was in like 9 episodes. I worked with him.
He's the only defense attorney in Baltimore.
I like what you said, Reed. The idea of them never going into the courtroom. That one shot where the door opens and Melissa tries to peek through and see with Bo on the on the witness seat. That was, for some reason, very powerful to me.
I know. I'd love a whole episode of that, of just in that anteroom. It feels like so Homicide.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Let's do it now.
We'll shoot it.
And props to Jelko.
Yeah, Jelko's the best.
What does he say? Excuse the blood under the seat?
There's blood on the floor in there. I destroyed her. This is where I will again direct people to the book, because that's also out of the book. And the cross-examination of the girlfriend is nuts.
Which we don't see.
We don't see, because go to the book and you will read. It is very entertaining. It's the character who Lisa Gay Hamilton plays in the previous episode, where she was very much putting on airs. Like, imagine that on the stand, and she is just destroying all of that clever lawyering with her performance and not realizing it. It is definitely worth going in and reading about what happened in real life with that case.
Page 400.
Hang on. I didn't mark that part specifically.
Another unsung actor in our little thing was the guy who played the Chinese diplomat, Alvin Lum. Very real. And that incredible dialogue, like it's hard to talk when you're on 2 blowhorns and there's tanks going by. Some great dialogue, and he's terrific. Old school Broadway actor.
And Ed Lauder.
I've always loved him. And he took it in a very strange little direction, but I still loved it a lot. No one has any reaction to he took it in a strange direction.
I was trying to be kind.
No,
Not him. I felt like the construct of how they would interact with the Secret Service was kind of bullshit. That was such a missed opportunity in the Homicide way of what it really would have been like if you've got a guy from the Secret Service dealing with Baltimore cops who he probably doesn't think anything of. That would have been an interesting dynamic. And then that he's going to take them on a tour just so we go to Ford's Theater. But that did bring up something for me. One of my favorite memories of being on the show was you were so close to D.C., and this was all pre-9/11, so you could go into anything, anywhere. You could just walk right in. You could go into the Capitol. You could go watch them, as it should be. You should be able to watch your government doing its thing. That access that you had to D.C. was magical back in the day.
And also, being on Homicide, you could actually have someone call there and say, hey, can they get a tour of this thing? And
That was the best part, because I'd never sat behind home plate in my life, and then you could just be like, hey, can I go sit behind home plate at Camden Yards? And you're like, yeah,
Right.
when do you want to go?
Yeah, we got some perks, didn't we, Reed?
Well, basically, I mean, I didn't run afoul of the law, but had I run afoul of the law, I feel like I had a pretty good get out of jail free card. And I know some people who did run afoul of the law, and that get out of jail free card
I've been
worked.
so curious about that because there was these stories about Jerry Orbach on Law and Order that he was like the mayor of New York. Everybody, wherever he went, everybody loved him. Cops would like pull over and hey, Jerry, do you need a lift wherever you're going? And so I was always curious, Baltimore being different and the tone of what you were doing being different. Did you guys ever experience that with the Baltimore cops or the residents?
Oh, 100%. That was my favorite part about being on the show was cops love that show. I remember walking through Penn Station. I'm getting off the train from Baltimore, and some guy's like, "Hey, Kellerman," and I turn around, and I'll never forget it because his name was Officer Hellman. He was an undercover cop working the train station. He's like, "I'm Officer Hellman," like the mayonnaise. They love that show. My wife always jokes about it. She goes, "You think you were a cop?" And because I'll always go up to cops and talk to them and stuff like that. and they always recognize you. In Hollywood, my neighbors were viciously murdered and beheaded. I luckily wasn't there. Speaking of DC, I was seeing the Madonna concert in DC because of my buddy, Dr. Kim, who I met in Baltimore. He invited me to go see Madonna. So Madonna saved my family's life. But when I came back, I see a cop out. I can tell he's a detective, like looking at the house. And I walk over, I'm like, and he recognized me from the show. So he started telling me all these details about the case. I'm like, why do you think he did it? Blah, blah, blah. He's like, because he's a fucking asshole. That was the motive.
In your head, do you step outside your body and imagine the camera kind of circling you guys and waiting for like the triple cut 100%. There and something he says? He's an asshole. He's an asshole.
100%. That's exactly what it is. So I love talking to cops. I got into trouble in Canada. I tried to do that. This is like a month ago. I'm coming back from the farmer's market and I'm walking. I was like, oh, that's a shell casing on the ground. I looked down. I was like, that's a 45 shell casing. And it's in Toronto. You don't expect that. So I took off my little scarf, my little sun scarf, and I picked it up gently and I saw a cop waiting over there, and I said, has there been a shooting here recently? He's like, no. Why are you asking? I was like, well, I found this. And then he proceeds to interrogate me. I was like, I'm just trying to turn in this shell casing. I thought I solved a homicide.
Well, I was curious about the reaction from locals, because I remember there's a scene in the 4th season. I'm pretty sure you're in it, Kyle. It's you and Belzer at the bar, and Jay Leno walks in, and you guys are both making a big point of not being impressed. And in one of the books, I think it's the other thing I have here is I have the Homicide companion here, unofficial companion.
Never seen that book before.
Yeah, there we go. You got it too. And they mentioned that it was inspired by the way that the locals would sometimes try not to be impressed when they would run into you TV stars. And so I was always wondering, like, what was the degree of like people gushing to people being like, I know who you are, and I'm not even gushing over you.
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't even know what that. I just know when people gushed. I never saw people like withholding gushing. I will say this is that the weirdest time someone recognized me was when my wife was giving birth, and we're in her room, and the doctor or the anesthesiologist comes in, or someone comes in, and they look at me and they go, oh, holy shit. And I go, no, no, her. I've got someone here giving birth. Please pay attention. But wait a second. Can I get your, like, okay, let's just handle this stuff first.
No, I have a question. Do you think that after the movie, Bayless...
Yeah, do you hear her? She's screaming, help, help.
Andre Braugher was so good on that show.
Yeah. Yeah, Andre, can we talk about Andre? Fuck that. Listen, okay, wait, read. Go to, quickly, that bar with the trough.
There was a great bar around the corner from where we shot, and it had a porcelain trough all the way around it. Because back in the day there, it was men only in those bars. So you didn't have to get up. You could just whip it out and just keep it going, which is amazing. You know, you're just living a life of leisure. I always wanted to pee.
That was an amazing thing.
But what they said was, I go, that's a trough for peeing. They're like, no, it's a spittoon. It's a spittoon. I'm like, oh, really? You're going to make a long spittoon that runs the entire length of the bar with water running through it just for your chewing tobacco?
Sailboats going up and down it now? Come on.
Like how some of the stadiums still have that, that same sort of setup. The long trough.
Yeah. The long trough.
Oh, yeah.
I went to a gay bar in Nashville, Tennessee. I was doing a play in Nashville, Tennessee, and there was a Roadhouse gay bar way out in the country because it was the only thing that would be still open after midnight, and they only had one bathroom. It had a long trough, and then above there was a mirror angled down so everyone could see who how it was going down there.
Oh my
Get
God.
out of here.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it was just angled towards the trough. Yeah, good times. Good times.
Hey, guys, I've got to go. If you want to continue this conversation, Reed, please do.
I want to ask Adam a couple questions about him, and then because this was like so gosh darn good. Well, let's.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. This is a blast. This is the highlight. I've been waiting to do this. This is fantastic.
You were great, just great.
We've never had an hour and a half fly by like this quickly. This was bananas. Kyle, I love you.
I love you, Reed, and I always have.
You're delicious and nutritious.
You're like a vitamin. You're vitamin K for Kellerman.
You better not cut any of that out, guys.
We keep the schmoosh in there.
After show chat, after show chat, it's a chat after the show. After show chat, after show chat, it's a chat after the show.
Give you an opportunity if there's anything more you want to talk about or questions you had.
This is good because I had a couple questions for you that wouldn't seem weird if Kyle's not weighing in. So you guys are masters of the Yaphet Kotto story. Like every episode has got a brilliant one, and just when I think like that must be all of them, you pull out another one.
You can catch me and Clark cracking up with him because sometimes Yaphet would just do wild shit. He would just say weird words or certainly not know his lines. Oftentimes he didn't know his lines because it was a technique to get a single. He would do this trick, right, where he wouldn't know his words. And so he'd be in the normal Homicide shooting of it all where everyone's getting covered. And they're going, Yaphet, we didn't get it. We're just going to have to put the camera on you and do a single. And then he'd be word perfect. Word perfect. There'd be times where he would just say crazy sentences. Like it would just come out gobbledygook. And Clark and I would just laugh. Because of the way we shot it, you'd often go with what was happening in the moment and just play with it. Because on a normal show, they'd be going, well, no, that's not appropriate. You can't be reacting that way. We've got these 3 colors that you're allowed to paint with, and you can only paint with these colors in this scene. With the Homicide of it all, it could be weird, and you could have an incongruous reaction to a situation just because there might be the play within the play. Because that was the other thing, too. At a certain point, the actors were the characters. If you're reacting to Yaphet doing something bizarre, it's how you would be reacting to G on some level. As I've said a million times, he was one of my most favorite actors of all time. And everything he did, he was perfect in. And watching him on this rewatch, it's been a real revelation to see how much he got to do and how nuanced he is. Because you want him to be scary and funny. Because he is. Because he can, as Tom said, which is how I always describe Yaphet, his hands are bigger than your head, and he could just crush your head. But he was gentle. I mean, like I said, I've watched him storm off set a billion times, but he wasn't the only one. Per the Belzer hemp story, I remember early on, Belzer's just having a conniption on set, and they're like, do you want to go to your trailer for a minute? And he's like, yeah. And he goes down to his trailer, and then he comes back, and he's all placid and gentle because he needed his he needed a top off.
As you have aged into the veteran actor, and I know you've talked on here before about the transition where like you were going from the guy asking Malcolm McDowell for stories to being the guy applied for stories. Did you ever clock when that happened on set, when someone's coming up to you and going, oh, Mr. Diamond, I loved you on Homicide, or I loved you on this? Like, does that happen to you now when you're Yaphet?
I'm Yaphet now. I am Yaphet now, right? It's the craziest thing going from being the youngest guy in a show or on a call sheet to the oldest. And what's so hilarious, nothing's changed. You're the same guy, but now because you've got all of these years of experience and people have seen you on shows, and certainly, obviously, Homicide, your stories are 10 times more interesting suddenly, and they're the same stories, but suddenly now everyone wants to hear the stories, and they're exciting. And then you realize, oh, you have good stories, because that was the other thing, too. I remember just sitting at Malcolm's knee, and I go, oh, God, I just want to have some stories. How can I be more like Malcolm? And then you go, oh, I guess I do have some stories. It's funny because I was talking to my wife about this too. I mean, being an older actor, I think the other thing that you can do that's really interesting, I was just doing this movie in Ireland in the spring, and there's a lot of younger actors. And now what I always do on the first day is I'll just mention, I'm nervous. And they're like, you're nervous? And it breaks the tension because everyone's nervous. And part of the game, when I was younger, I would never admit I was nervous, but everyone's nervous. And the better the actor, usually the more nervous you are because the more you care. You have a reasonable expectation that you'll be able to do your job, but it hasn't happened yet. I hope I'll be good today. And that's my favorite actor story of all time, which is a homicide story. I think about it every day, and I'll tell it to actors all the time. So when Charles Durning came and guest starred, he has this great speech. So we're sitting in the bar listening to him. It's me and Clark and Seda and Buscemi's directing, and I'm sitting right next to Charles Durning. I mean, talk about character actor heroes. I mean, Charles Durning's a god to me, right? I mean, just his performance alone in Dog Day Afternoon, but the Muppet Movie, like he's one of those guys who could do everything, right? So he does the monologue the first time, and it's a big speech, it's at least a page and a half, and it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And then he does it again, and it's brilliant, different, but brilliant. He does it the third time, and he goes, that one was good. And I go, oh, Mr. Durning, sir, they were all great. He goes, yeah, but that was the only one where I wasn't thinking if you guys thought I was any good. And I said, it never goes away, does it? And he goes, never goes away. And this is a war hero. That's the other thing that's, I buried the lead of this. This guy was wounded 4 times, landed on D-Day, machine gunned, had his throat cut, he got bayoneted, and they kept throwing him back out. So he landed on D-Day and fought all the way through the Battle of the Bulge. This is a guy who's seen some shit. And he still cares, and he has that sensitivity and that insecurity that we all have. For me, that's the most important acting lesson. Yeah, it never goes away. That's my Charles Durning story. I first became aware of you because of the Bitter Script Reader. How did that all come about?
It was my bid to get noticed, basically. It really goes back to, I was aware that there were some people who had attracted the attention of TV writers by being like super fans of the show in an analytical way. Like, some guys who were like writing reviews of every episode of Star Trek or whatever. It was an era when those writers were online, and sometimes they go, oh, why don't you come in and pitch to us? In my head now, I'm like, oh, smart guy, come here. Let's see if you know how to do it. But my thought was, I always had wanted to find some way to get noticed online, because it wasn't working for me, just like reading scripts. And eventually I'm like, well, hey, at that point I'd been reading scripts either in development or just as a script reader for CAA for 5 years. And I'm like, so maybe the idea is, because I was discovering a lot of how to, write blogs or screenwriting blogs, maybe if I'm writing a blog that's based on my experience, I don't feel like a charlatan saying, here's how you should write. Like, I'm not telling you as a successful writer, here's how you should write. I'm telling you as the guy who's the gatekeeper, who has read, 3,000 scripts this year, everything I'm seeing wrong. Like, I can at least tell you, these are the cliches. If you're just writing a spec script, you're not seeing a lot of spec scripts, and you're not knowing that the thing that you think is brilliant is also being done by 2,000 other people, and it's a red flag. It's something that everybody does their first time out. Every writer who started writing probably has written that one script. It's like, there's no real structure. It's loose. It's an indie feel. It's like 4 buds hanging out on a weekend. It's maybe the last weekend of their lives before they go off to college, or before they graduate college, or before they get married. The particulars are different, but like you know that kind of movie. You know that kind of 90s Sundance movie that it's one night. It's American Graffiti, but edgy. Everybody has written that, and I've read it 100 times. Or I've read the horror movie 100 times with the killer with the weird motif. You know the structure. Scream is brilliant, and some of those other slasher movies are brilliant, but when you get to the people who are like, oh, I'm going to write the next Scream, and they don't do anything original, you're like, here's the pitfall I have seen 100 people make in doing this thing. Like, you don't want to kill off anybody too important, and you're trying to drag it out. So that first kill is an unrelated kill that takes up 10 pages at the beginning, because the story doesn't start until page 40. And your trick is you've never made this first scene matter anywhere else. So when I'm reading the script, I'm halfway through before anything of consequence happens. It was all advice like that at the beginning. And so very quickly I exhausted my supply of direct experience and advice there. And it turned into, oh, well, I should also just occasionally, if I see something that I thought was great writing in a show or a movie, let me do a post about that. Within a couple months of me starting the blog, I also got on Twitter, which was at that point just emerging. And that was when I started getting a following. And the following almost validates you in a way where professionals started following me because, oh, he's tweeted something insightful about this. I'll follow him. Oh, this guy, he's got at that point 5,000 followers. Well, he seems to know something. And then the other aspect that I found out was helpful is because I was anonymous, which at the time wasn't a marketing gimmick. It was just, well, I'm writing about my job, I'm blogging about my job. I don't want to get fired. I don't want to write something about this shitty script I read for CAA and have somebody in CAA say, okay, he's fired because he let out privileged information, even if he didn't say what the script was, even if he vagued it up. Like, I'm not going to hire somebody who's then going to go on the internet and blog about it. That was the whole reason behind the nom de plume, was just I did not want to cut off any future employment, and I also did not want to get to the point where, like, I got an employer who said, if we're hiring you, you're going to have to stop. stop it. So that was why I was anonymous, but it created this mystique where people, because some people assume if someone's a mystery, they must know who it is, and it's not just some schmo who grew up in Ohio who's living in West Hollywood. Right. You know, they're like, oh, do you think it's him? Oh, I think it's this guy. Oh, it might be the assistant here. And so that also built up enough. Eventually, when I started like interacting with people who were produced screenwriters, produced TV writers, it was a lot easier to get a coffee with them because they would offer, because they were curious to meet this mysterious guy and get to say, hey, I know who this guy is, but it gave a whole nother level of excitement to meeting me, who was at this point, again, still a nobody, who was, you know, reading scripts, had worked in development, was still trying to get my own stuff around. And that kind of opened some doors. And one of my favorite things to do would be to go to either a gathering of writers, like at a Blacklist party, or Comic-Con was a great place to do this because half the people I followed on Twitter were at Comic-Con. And so I'd be at a party there and I would recognize some writer as someone who I had like interactions with, but we'd never met. And I would always go over and go, hey, we follow each other on Twitter. Oh, really? Oh, who are you? I was go, Bitter Script Reader, and always be like, oh my God, oh, so good to meet you. And it's like instantly you're old friends with this person you're meeting for the first time. So it was a great way to kind of open doors. And I can't remember when you followed me, because you were already following me when we eventually had our interaction. I probably tweeted something about the Mahoney shooting, because I'd written a couple posts about that, and you probably saw it and followed me off of that, is my guess.
But you reached out to me and you're like, we should get a beer.
No. You offered.
Did I
remember.
Offer?
It was your offer, because I remember it started because Jay Farber was tweeting about Homicide, and I think he had gotten up to either Mahoney shooting or one of your other episodes, and so I was responding to him, and because I like quote tweeted him, you saw it because you were following my feed, and so you jumped in, and it was like, oh, holy shit, Kellerman's here. But you were the one who, after like 10 minutes of interacting, was like, so when are we getting beers? Because I remember going, I'm free whenever. I'm good. When do you want to meet? And then at this point, you were living 2 hours away from LA, which none of us realized at the time. Eventually we coordinated it, and none of us knew until the day you were coming down that you were driving 2 hours just to have beers with us. And I felt bad about that, because like we tried to coordinate a couple times. I think you were always trying to piggyback on like something you were doing in town, so you were just you were playing it cool, like, oh yeah, no, that's a great day for me. I'm free that day. And then that day you're like, okay, boys, I'm about to drive down, and I'm like, wait. You're coming all this way for us? Oh, holy shit! We would have come up and met you, But that's the guy you are. You were just like, I want to meet these two guys. I should say for everybody who's listening, Jay Farber, he's worked on many TV shows. At the time, he was on Supergirl. He's done a show called Zoo. He was on Ringer. Like he's got way more TV credits than I do.
I think we did a Jay question early on. I think Jay Farber.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I hope so. Well, once again, the reason you're here, Adam, and I think we're going to make you a permanent part of the show, or a regular part of the show, because you remember my life better than I remember a life.
Well, I remember your life, the part of your life that's in the unauthorized companion.
Well, I'm gonna have to read this to find out about myself.
That's it. Yeah. There was somebody else who I had talked to who was written up in one of these, telling them the story, and they're like, "That's bullshit. That did not happen that way." But I mean, that's also the normal course of add 20 years to anything that happens on a show, and you talk to 3 people there, and they're like, "No, that's not how that went down. I remember that thing where I'm the hero of that story."
That's the whole reason we're doing this. Is the Rashomon of it is that everyone has a different memory, and because there were a lot of substances involved, a lot of late nights, and a lot of partying. Some people are a little foggier than others. What's apocryphal and what's true?
Especially because there are 2 podcasts going on now, and so we're getting like from Life on the Set, we're getting their side and we're getting your side, and you guys have all gone on there, and so there's similar stories there. But it is interesting, I think it came up in the Tom episode. Tom remembers thinking of 3 Men and a Dean as sitting there while shooting Gone for Good. Kyle remembers it as being a part of the first meeting he ever had about the show. So like, who is right in that one?
It's great that you bring up our sibling podcast, Homicide Life on the Set, Chris Carr and Susan Ingram, who was first AC on Homicide, because it's an incredible podcast. And we guys all do very different things. We had a lovely meeting at the Homicide reunion in Baltimore. I got to meet Chris from England, he has a podcast about spies as well. He's very into intelligence officers, and he's lovely. And Susan is great. And we do very different things. I feel like we complement each other. Adam, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart and from Kyle's heart. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Thank you so much for all of your input throughout, all of your support, and all of your wisdom. Kyle and I cannot wait to have you back on this show again.
This was a blast. This exceeded my expectations. I hope it is entertaining for everybody who's listening to it. I will come back whenever you guys need me. Again, even on a dud episode. Let me curse myself right here.
You classed up the joint so much. I knew you would, because Kyle was like, oh, I don't know what we're going to say about this. I go, don't worry. Adam's going to be here, and he's going to raise the level of discourse, and you far exceeded anything. Kyle was just texting me right now. I was like, this was so much fun.
Oh, that's good.
And we wouldn't be here without you. Honestly, I think about your words of wisdom every week, and when someone says, oh, it's what it should be, I go, no, this is what it should be. It's what Adam said. We're just going to tell you the behind the stories.
You give me too much credit. You give me too much credit.
Well, you know I love you, and thank you so much for being a part of this today, buddy.
Thanks for having me. I thought I'd be like season 5 or whatever when you ran out of everybody important. So when you were like, you want to come on for episode 8, I'm like, yes, sure. Okay, let's do it.
Thanks, buddy.
Thank you. Thank you so much.